opening the center immediately, staking a claim for rapid development and peace activity. The Sicilian defense immediately sparks a battle for central control, creating imbalanced pawn structures ripe for sharp tactical play. Instantly challenging black's flank structure, this knight leap prepares for pawn advances and aims to seize central space. Developing a knight here immediately contests central squares and prepares for active piece play. Unleashing central pressure, white immediately challenges black's pawn structure, aiming for open lines and active piece play. Instantly opening the c-file, black forces white to commit their knight, shaping the central pawn structure and setting the stage for positional maneuvering. Recapturing centrally opens the diagonal for your bishop and prepares rapid development, seizing the initiative. Developing the knight here pressures white's e4 pawn, a classic response in this Sicilian structure, aiming to disrupt white's central pawn control. Developing another knight solidifies central influence and prepares for rapid kingside castling. Fortifying the central pawn structure now solidifies black's pawn chain and opens a diagonal for the bishop. Instantly, white pins the knight, creating an immediate imbalance and forcing black to consider their response carefully. This pressure along the b5-e2 diagonal aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially prepare for an aggressive kingside assault later on. Black's usual solid pawn chain is now under scrutiny, and any misstep could lead to weakened squares. Developing the bishop to the 7th rank immediately prepares for a potential a6 pawn push, challenging white's imposing queenside presence and often initiating exchanges that simplify the position while also opening diagonals for the black pieces. Securing the monarch initiates a new phase, clearing the king's path to safety behind a pawn shield and bringing the rook closer to the center, a vital piece often neglected in the early skirmishes of this Sicilian defense. Solidifying the pawn structure and preparing to challenge the central tension by enabling the bishop. Developing the bishop to e3, white aims to pressure the knight on c6 and potentially provoke weaknesses in black's pawn structure, all while ensuring castling is safe and sound. This proactive piece placement prepares for future queenside expansion or central breaks. Bringing the bishop into play completes the development of black's kingside, a sensible preparatory step before castling and solidifying the pawn structure. The piece now supports the central pawns and prepares to defend the king once it's tucked away. Instigating a subtle shift in focus, the queen gracefully advances, preparing to join the central skirmish and possibly shepherd a rook to the king's flank, all while maintaining a watchful eye on the d6 pawn should black's knight choose a more aggressive trajectory. Casting the king to safety here is a prudent defensive measure, solidifying the kingside and preparing for potential central pawn breaks or tactical skirmishes that might arise from white's active piece development. Activating the rook on the d-file immediately contests black's control, preparing for potential pawn pushes or exchanges that could open up the center. Preparing to contest the d-file and potentially support b5 pawn advance, black's queen now eyes the central files and adds defensive stability to the kingside castled position. This repositioning is a logical step in consolidating black's defenses before white can fully exploit the open d-file. Preparing to challenge the center's control and repositioning for central activity, the knight heads back to its starting square, anticipating a potential kingside initiative or a flexible maneuver to a more active square depending on black's response. Challenging the bishop's influence on the queenside, black proactively seeks to disrupt white's developing harmony and deny the light-squared bishop a comfortable perch, potentially opening a line for the queen or a rook later on. Developing the bishop to d3 solidifies white's central control and prepares to contest the d-file, hinting at a potential pawn push to d5 later if the opportunity arises. Unlocking the queenside, black initiates a pawn thrust to gain queenside space and potentially disrupt white's coordination, a characteristic theme in many Sicilian structures where queenside action often dictates the game's flow and creates imbalances to exploit. Unleashing a pawn thrust into the center immediately creates dynamic imbalances, potentially forcing black's knight from its secure post and seizing a foothold for white's pieces in the d6 square. The pawn push on e5 dramatically alters the pawn structure, creating a tension white now seeks to exploit. Black's capture on e5 is a necessary reaction, opening a diagonal for the queen and freeing the f6 knight, but it also concedes central space and potentially weakens the d6 square. This exchange, while seemingly simple, sets the stage for a dynamic battle where white will likely aim to leverage the open central files and target black's king, while black will need to carefully counter white's initiative and find opportunities for piece activity. Unleashing a surprise assault on black's pinned knight, white seeks to disrupt the harmonious arrangement of black's pieces and potentially pry open lines towards the monarch. The idea is to leverage this tactical pin for positional advantage, creating immediate discomfort and forcing black to react defensively, potentially sacrificing tempo or positional harmony to resolve the immediate threat. Re-establishing the knight's outpost on the e-file solidifies black's central presence and prepares for potential pawn pushes down the line, while simultaneously creating a defensive screen around the king. Preparing to unleash a powerful rook battery along the e-file now that the central pawn tension has eased, white aims to exploit the potential weaknesses around black's king and pressure the d6 pawn, creating multifaceted threats. Challenging the bishop's influence and opening lines towards the kingside, this pawn advance seeks to dislodge white's potentially troublesome bishop from its active diagonal and potentially create play down the h-file if white retreats. It forces white to decide the fate of that bishop immediately. Shifting the bishop to the edge of the board now aims to disrupt black's queenside pawn structure and potentially prepare a later attack on the g7 pawn, though it does create a slight vulnerability on the h4 square itself. Initiating a powerful central occupation, this knight seizure immediately injects dynamism into the board, challenging white's central pawn structure and hinting at a potential queenside initiative. Black daringly sacrifices a tempo on the bishop's retreat to sharpen the tactical fight, forcing white to react to this bold central penetration. Shifting the queen to e4 reshapes white's central presence, eyeing the potentially exposed black king while also preparing to contest the f-file, creating a more dynamic tactical scenario. Sacrificing the bishop on h4, a bold decision to alleviate pressure, but it does open up the f-file and the king's sanctuary, potentially creating future complications with the rook now staring down that central axis. Initiating a decisive king hunt, white sacrifices the queen to dislodge the black monarch from its sanctuary and open lines for an onslaught, transforming the positional struggle into a sharp tactical skirmish where precise calculation becomes paramount. The king's desperate scramble across the board, abandoning its sanctuary for the uncertainty of the sixth rank, highlights a profound positional dilemma. Black is forced to prioritize survival over development, conceding the initiative and accepting a cramped defensive posture. The sacrifice of the knight on h4 injects a sharp tactical element, aiming to pry open the black king's defenses by forcing further pawn advances or creating vital attacking lines. This aggressive posture seeks to capitalize on the slightly exposed black monarch and potentially exploit the now unprotected dark squares around it, while simultaneously eliminating a key defender of the d5 outpost. The knight embarks on a journey to solidify control of the center, aiming to disrupt white's active pieces and potentially create counterplay on the kingside. Unleashing the queen into the heart of the enemy camp, this forcing sequence dramatically alters the complexion of the game, aiming to liquidate the opponent's king's defenses through a dizzying series of checks. Black retreats the knight, conceding the open h-file and the immediate attacking potential white had generated. This defensive maneuver, while regaining material equality, does little to alleviate the pressure building around the king and significantly restricts the scope of the black pieces, particularly the rook on f8, which now finds its path to freedom completely blocked. Black's king is now exposed, a consequence of the pawn push and subsequent piece exchanges, creating a precarious situation where attacking lines are opening up. A strategic redeployment begins as the knight tucks itself away onto a more defensive square, seeking refuge from the immediate tactical storms while subtly eyeing the kingside as a potential future avenue of activity. The rook's repositioning to e3 opens a diagonal for the queen, creating potential pressure along the third rank and subtly preparing to reinforce the kingside if the opportunity arises, all while maintaining a solid defensive structure. Black redirects the bishop's gaze to the queen's flank, aiming to fortify their pawn structure and potentially prepare for a counterthrust on the queen's side. This repositioning is a quiet but crucial step in re-establishing defensive harmony and exploring new avenues of counterplay, a stark contrast to the recent tactical skirmishes. Unlocking the H-file for the white rooks, this repositioning aims to escalate pressure on the kingside, potentially creating batteries or supporting an E6 pawn push. Unshackling the D-file from its defensive burden, Red is now poised to contest control of this critical open column, aiming to disrupt White's central structure and potentially open lines towards the kingside. Sacrificing the bishop on G8 abruptly severs Black's defensive pawn chain, exposing the king and creating a dynamic imbalance as White repositions for an aggressive kingside assault. The knight's retreat to G8, while seemingly passive, subtly untangles Black's pieces, bringing a defender back to the vicinity of the weakened king and preparing for potential counterplay on the queen side or through the center, a vital step after White's aggressive piece deployment. A dramatic sacrifice is unleashed, opening lines towards the enemy king with a knight's aggressive thrust, forcing a confrontation where material is secondary to the impending checkmate threat. Embracing the immediate king hunt after sacrificing a bishop, Black accepts the knight's entry at the cost of opening the F-file to their monarch, a potentially perilous choice that invites further attack along the newly liberated diagonal and column. Unleashing a powerful discovered check, this knight jump initiates a brutal sequence that rips open Black's king defenses. Sacrificing the bishop here surrenders the initiative and opens up White's attack even further. Black desperately needed to shore up their king's defenses instead of entering this material exchange, which only fuels White's aggressive setup and grants them a dangerous open G-file for further incursions. Sacrificing the rook to clear the path for the knight's devastating invasion and expose Black's king to a swift checkmate is a brilliant strategic gambit, fundamentally altering the game's dynamic towards a decisive tactical showdown. The queen retreats to a more active diagonal, setting up potential harassment along the G-file and eyeing the vulnerable white king's remaining pawn shield. Initiating a pawn storm on the kingside, a bold attempt to exploit the exposed Black monarch after the recent exchanges and open lines. Unleashing the queenside pawn, Black aims to pry open the B-file for counterplay against White's potentially exposed king, a daring gambit as White has just sacrificed a knight to clear the path for their own offensive. Unlocking the H-file is the clear objective, aiming to pry open the enemy's king position further. This repositioning of the knight is not just about attacking, it's about creating potential discovered attacks or forks later, depending on Black's response. The pressure on the D-file from White's rook is now amplified, as the knight on E4 adds defensive potential to that line should Black attempt to contest it. Consider the subsequent tactical possibilities that arise from this repositioning. Can White exploit the weakened pawn structure around Black's king once the knight is optimally placed? Black boldly steers the fight towards the open central files, recognizing the imminent threat of White's knight on E4 and aiming to neutralize it by offering a rook exchange, which will not only simplify the position but also potentially create counterplay on the D-file if White declines. A decisive blow ending the game, exploiting the exposed king and shattered pawn structure to force the exchange of rooks. The dust has settled after a chaotic exchange, and Black's king, now exposed on F8, faces a stark reality. The open files and White's remaining pieces are poised to exploit this vulnerability, signaling a swift and decisive endgame. Seizing the open C-file now opens up possibilities for the queen to penetrate the Black position, creating imbalances that could prove decisive as the game transitions towards an endgame. The rook's repositioning to the open file is a strategic pivot, aiming to contest crucial lines and prevent White's knight from further incursions into Black's weakened kingside. Unleashing the pawns to clear lines towards the enemy monarch, this advance aims to reopen critical avenues for attack now that the center is fractured. Re-establishing pressure on the kingside, The knight's return to the center aims to exploit the exposed white king and the compromised pawn structure after the recent exchanges.